this is not about rehabilitation. It's more about economic exploitation, understanding that, our ancestors literally were brought here to be exploited with their labor. And still to this day, hundreds of years later, that exploitation continues because of loopholes in our government.
Black Americans, we're still on the bottom cast of this society, but it's particularly the incarcerated population within our community that truly, truly, truly is on the bottom cast and still are treated as slaves.
Welcome to the Know Your Rights Camp podcast. I'm your host, Amir, joined with our guest, civil rights lawyer Kamilah Moore. Thanks for joining us, Kamilah.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us for this conversation today on private prisons and forced labor. So another area you have some experience in, and another area that today's landscape is impacting even more. Lots of stuff happening with our federal government, some step backs happening. Specifically under the Trump administration, there's the reverse of the executive order that President Biden signed that the people fought for, and actually the work began before his administration. But Executive Order 14006 to, quote, eliminate the use of privately operated criminal detention facilities. And because of this, up to over 14,000 people would be removed from federal prisons, detention centers, and other things. And now, under the Trump administration, this order has been reversed. And we know there are actually several people in Trump's cabinet that had funds and investments in the private prison industry and in organizations like Geo Group, Core Civic, and others. So the private prison industry is vast, and it's not just the prisons being operated from a private organization, but it's oftentimes the labor being outsourced to other organizations, the materials being made inside the prisons being made for corporations like McDonald's or Walmart and other things, but also lots of universities, lots of schools, lots of investment accounts actually invest in private prisons.
Yes.
So are you familiar with this?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for bringing that up because, while I was a student at UCLA, an undergraduate, I was a part of the African Student Union. We worked in a coalition of student organizations. And we discovered through research, for instance, that the entire University of California, so not just UCLA, but the entire UC system, had over $30 million worth of holdings, investments in private prisons, like namely, the GEO Group and CCA. And so, the African Student Union, we led the charge to essentially lobby the UC to divest their holdings in private prisons. And we actually were successful. We were actually able to get the UC to divest $30 million of holdings from CCA and GEO. We tried to also get them to divest from Wells Fargo. The UC had a $100 billion endowment, and they $425 million of it was invested in Wells Fargo, which also has a hold in private prisons, but we weren't able to get the UC to commit to divest from Wells Fargo, but we did count our wins in getting them to divest at least $30 million from, directly the holdings that they had, in private prisons.
Oh, that's amazing. And unfortunately, it's not just the UC system, but universities all across the country are invested into private prisons. It almost seems like it's a rollover from slavery, right? Because we know lots of universities actually owned enslaved Africans. And when you profit off of people being incarcerated, it's something similar where people are losing their freedom, but you are gaining some monetary value for this. And once President Trump was elected, the private prison stocks shot straight up. And one of the things most disturbing of this is happening right now is our current Attorney General, Pam Bondi, at the Department of Justice, before becoming into the Department of Justice and into politics, she was actually a lobbyist for getting paid for a Geo Group. And the lobby firm she worked for was getting almost $400,000 to advocate for private prisons.
I'm glad you mentioned that as well because, when we talk about the private prison industry, at least 10 years ago when I was doing that work as a student organizer, the private prison population, was about 8 to 10% of those folks incarcerated nationwide or in private prisons. But I just wanted to mention, though, the issue with private prisons isn't just the fact that there are people incarcerated in these prisons. These people who run private prisons, they also, lobby for, policies that are anti-Black, that try to fuel higher population numbers in these prisons. So you'll have, private prison lobbyists not only lobbying for more space, more infrastructure to house or to incarcerate people, but they'll also be lobbying for mandatory minimum sentences. They'll be lobbying for 3 strikes laws for nonviolent offenders. Like, they'll lobby for the most draconian criminal laws, again, to try to fuel as much people to go into these, prisons as much as possible, because it's all a numbers game to them. It's all about profit. And that's what really makes, private prisons in particular very perverse.
Right. It's not about rehabilitation. It's about filling the beds up, keeping them there. And it's not just prisons, but we have private detention centers. We have private juvenile centers. Where I started as a civil rights lawyer in Florida, the juvenile system was 100% privatized. And one of the first cases I was involved in was against one of these groups and their privatization. And what that led to was the cut in services, whether it's education, mental health, even the food that they were given, which we know the services and the food and the support you're given in any prison or detention center isn't great. But when the people running the facility feel loyalty to shareholders instead of the people inside it, then they cut every corner. So the types of abuses you would see in these private facilities were even worse than the publicly owned ones.
Absolutely.
So in the U.S., over 90% of detained immigrants are in private facilities owned by organizations like Geo Group and Core Civic that have these billion-dollar businesses, and 43% of Geo Group's funds came from private prison contracts in 2023. So think about that. Half of their money comes from our tax dollars to incarcerate people. And the super PAC owned by Geo Group actually was the first to max out the campaign donation to President Trump's presidential campaign. So literally, they invested into him knowing that he would create policies like what he just did, where he's ending the reforms to end private prisons in federal use. So there's been numerous lawsuits and investigations against Geo Group and Core Civic and others about the abuses that happen there. Sometimes you see the videos from incarcerated people sending them to the outside about, the toilets dismantling or the food that they're eating and different things. And these are well-documented abuses that we are now going to see an increase in. And the increase of privatization is just one of the things the Trump administration is doing with detentions and undocumented people. They're also now outsourcing our detention system and possibly our prison system. The president of El Salvador said that he welcomes U.S. citizens into his mega prisons as well as undocumented people. And the U.S. government has already sent hundreds of people to countries like Panama and even Guantanamo Bay. They're trying to use to house undocumented people. Now, Guantanamo Bay is this sort of like black site for civil rights where people have been held, indefinitely. People have been abused, tortured, waterboarded. The international community has condemned the practices happening at Guantanamo Bay, but now the Trump administration is trying to retool it to house undocumented people.
And, it just shows, again, we're just in very uncertain and dangerous times. It's really unfortunate because, undocumented people, speaking from a human rights lens, they absolutely do have human rights, particularly if, undocumented people are coming into America as refugees, like seeking asylum. There are certain sets of rights that they should be afforded, due process rights in particular. That definitely seem to be impeded on as Trump has regained power. there are, coalitions of organizations, legislators who are keeping a watchful eye on what Trump is doing, particularly on immigration. And so, for instance, California, they just, through the governor, allocated $50 million. The state legislature in a special session allocated, $25 million. So there's at least $75 million in the state of California alone to help fight against what Trump is doing on this issue.
Yeah, I remember the state of California sued the Trump administration over 100 times last time, sometimes because of what is considered a sanctuary state. California is considered a sanctuary state that does not cooperate with immigration and law enforcement, immigration customs enforcement. And the current attorney general has now declared war on sanctuary cities and states and has called for the defunding of these sanctuary jurisdictions in an attempt to force them to just comply and hand over citizens. But there have been so many abuses happening that literally local governments have to stand up and put their hand out and say, we're not going to allow the federal government to continue this. And the due process violations you mentioned and the right to seek asylum that you mentioned that are all being gutted by this administration are an attempt to increase the number of people in detention, because when they're denied access to the right to claim asylum or different things, they're sometimes sent to these facilities or held in these facilities indefinitely. And the administration is trying to force governments, whether it's Mexico or Panama, all throughout Central America, to comply with this. And it's almost like it's outsourcing of these facilities. The president of El Salvador said he could save us money, literally. But the mega prisons in El Salvador have been under investigation by United Nations, Amnesty International. I don't know if you've seen the pictures of just like all the brown bodies with their hands behind their heads, shaved heads, kind of like warehoused in El Salvador, which was a way they were combating the gang violence and the drugs. Now that they have addressed that issue somewhat and they have empty prisons, they're opening up the possibility to housing, undocumented people, but even U.S. citizens into these facilities.
Which is very alarming, right? Because, what does that look like for, like you said, U.S. citizens, like Black Americans even? Is there a possibility that we could be, deported to a different country? That's quite literally insane to think about the possibility, but,
right.
Times we're in. Yeah.
That's the reality. Just because it's cheaper. And we have this government that is trying to cut corners and save dollars in ways that don't require, billionaire tax cuts, so it's a very scary world we're living in. Now, something else that relates to private prison is private prison labor, not just in the private prisons, but in other prison facilities. There's actually an exception and a loophole that allows for, slavery, forced labor. So the 13th Amendment states, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime whereof the party shall be duly convicted, shall exist in the United States. Legalized discrimination, constitutional discrimination in the 13th Amendment.
Yeah, which also has been incorporated, the 13th Amendment into state constitutions as well. So you have states all across the country that also had that loophole, including California,
right,
where if you are incarcerated, duly convicted of a crime, you could be forced to work, forced to labor in, like you said, California public prison facilities. And so, all across the nation, though, there's been a movement to close that loophole, to eradicate it, to no longer allow forced labor, in prisons. State of California, through, a couple of legislators, Black women legislators over the course of the past couple of years, have tried very earnestly to amend the California Constitution to no longer allow that loophole. In order to do that, first they created, legislative bills. Sidney Kalmager, when she was in the state assembly, she's now in Congress. When she was in the state Senate, she introduced a bill to end forced labor in prisons. It died in the legislature.
Wow.
The next year, you had Assemblymember Lori Wilson introduce a bill to amend the California Constitution. It passed the state legislature, but because it required for the California Constitution to be amended, it had to go to our ballot. And
Right.
so it appeared on the ballot for California voters this past November 2024, but unfortunately it did not pass, right? So the majority
53% of people voted in favor of forced labor and slavery, or maybe didn't understand what they were voting for.
Right. Well, that's a great point. Maybe didn't understand what they voted for because there are some, there's people said that there was some confusion because the language as it appeared on the ballot was, vote for this proposition if you essentially feel like, incarcerated people should not be disciplined if they don't want to work. And so to some voters, that seemed kind of confusing, even
Right.
to some so-called liberal voters, some of them question, even black voters I heard this from, had said, well, sometimes incarcerated people should be disciplined. So whatever. So I say all that to say, the current news on this, though, is the same Assembly member, Lori Wilson, I believe she's introducing a similar bill to close that loophole, but the language will be much more clearer this time. The language that will appear on the ballot if it passes through the state legislature again this time will simply be all forms of slavery shall be prohibited, right?
Clear.
The very clear. So that will be the litmus test to see how progressive California voters are, because just this past November, that similar language appeared on the Nevada ballot because they also were presented with the opportunity to end that slavery loophole, and they actually voted in favor of it.
Nice.
So the logic and the idea is California will impose more clear language. All forms of slavery are prohibited, which obviously includes forced labor in prisons, and we'll see what the state and the voters say from there.
Great to hear that Nevada and other states are taking action. And yes, that was unfortunate that here in California, that setback was taken. But California is utilizing prison labor in very unique ways, controversial ways too. California, we're known for having these wildfires that require thousands of firefighters. And throughout history, they've been using prison labor. And even now, these recent wildfires that were historic, up to 900 incarcerated individuals there, putting their lives on the line, sacrificing their health for pennies. And that's something unique to California.
Unique to California, like you said, they're incarcerated young folks, right? Black and brown young men and even women that are, like you said, putting their lives on the line, being paid cents on the dollar to fight these fires. And when they actually, are freed, are no longer incarcerated, in the past, they've actually faced hurdles trying to become firefighters, right? After they've been, again, like I said, freed. And so, but, recently there's been legislation to kind of alleviate that. So now we're seeing more pathways, entryways for formerly incarcerated firefighters to actually become legit firefighters, once they transition.
Or fully paid firefighters, because they are doing legitimate work, because that fire will burn.
Right,
so they're legit firefighters.
Right.
And even doing some of the other emergency responses and clearing bush and other things that firefighters get tens of thousands of dollars to do, that they're getting a few dollars for. I want to read a quote by one of the incarcerated individuals, Amika Mota, who said, quote, "Every single firefighter out there is proud to be there, but they have signed away their rights to compensation in case of injury or death." So literally sacrificing and risking their lives to address the fires, but still exploited, legally exploited and constitutionally exploited.
Absolutely. Yeah. And like you said, there's legislation pending to essentially, give these incarcerated firefighters a fair wage, so to speak, so that they're no longer paid, cents on the dollar. So there's some progress, albeit incremental.
There's some progress. And there was progress happening at the federal level as well until the Trump administration started to reverse course. There are lots of federal programs that exploit prison labor. It's interesting, even after the end of slavery, still profiting off forced labor. So one program in particular, It's called the Prison Industry Enhancement Certification Program, so PIECP. It allows incarcerated individuals to work for private companies, but up to 80% of their wages are actually garnished to pay for different things or just taken from them. And people who are incarcerated, they manufacture electronics, furniture, military gear, perform public services, and different things. But this is not about rehabilitation. It's more about economic exploitation, understanding that, you know, our ancestors literally were brought here to be exploited with their labor. And still to this day, hundreds of years later, that exploitation continues because of loopholes in our government.
Absolutely. That is, what undergirds this system of mass incarceration. Black Americans, we're still on the bottom cast of this society, but it's particularly the incarcerated population within our community that truly, truly, truly is on the bottom cast and still are treated as slaves.
Oh, yeah. Second-class citizenship. I mean, as a formerly incarcerated person, I literally still have to check boxes, you know, despite everything else I've done in my life because of something I've done as a teenager. I still have to check boxes. I can still be discriminated against legally. And if I was an incarcerated person in a prison, I could be forced to work for Walmart or for Victoria's Secrets, which had incarcerated women, you know, sewing lingerie and removing tags that said made in China to falsely label the products as being made in the US. So there are so many corporations that profit directly off prison labor. And like you mentioned, it is a complicated thing because many people feel like incarcerated people, well, you should be punished. There's always been this tendency to focus on punishment instead of accountability or find creative ways to hold people accountable without stealing them from a community or, you know, taking a son away or a daughter away from a mother. And, you know, people have been fighting for that for years. I'm actually wearing a shirt right now with a lot of the ancestors. And one of them has Angela Davis, the prison abolition movement. You know, she was one of the board members of Critical Resistance. Shout out to Critical Resistance. They've been leading this abolition fight for a while and trying to get us to envision ways where we no longer need prisons. And I want to wrap us up with a quote from Angela Davis here, where she reminds us that, quote, prisons do not address the root causes of social issues, but instead disappear people deemed undesirable by society, end quote. And we know who's always been viewed as undesirable by this society, who's been persecuted from the very point when they're brought here, and whose bodies are still being exploited for the purposes of money.
Absolutely, and that is, Black people historically when we're talking about the United States. We're also talking about, mental health, mentally ill people, right? We've seen have been warehoused in, prisons after, mental hospitals, were closed down, in the 80s due to, Ronald Reagan's neoconservative policies. As an attorney, working on, police brutality or jail death cases, all over the South, I'm learning a lot of my clients, they didn't belong in prison.
Right.
They were mentally ill. They belonged in, a treatment facility, but not in a prison. And so, that quote still rings true today. So not only, does these systems of incarceration, disappear, people that society has deemed undesirable, to what you mentioned earlier, think about how it also impacts the families of these people as well. You know what I mean? Children, mothers, siblings, they're also impacted when their loved ones are incarcerated. You're taking away sources of income. You're taking away sources of emotional support. You're taking away all types of things when you warehouse folks away. And so we really have to, be intentional about eradicating, these systems and, adopting, this abolitionist framework and uplifting that in reparations conversations as well. That's why in the California Reparations Task Force, we, have a conversation around the criminal legal system, and we, propose solutions to eradicate those systems. And we also actually recommended for direct cash payments for victims of the war on drugs in the state of California as well.
America's longest and most expensive war that has created lots of casualties. And I mean, I myself am a veteran of this war. I haven't been incarcerated. I've lost friends and family members because of this war. My parents were stolen from me the same way under slavery, and my ancestors, their parents were stolen from them. My brother was stolen away from his children. So this is a war, and we need reparations. But at the very least, we need to do something to address it. And warehousing people in prisons, especially in private prisons that support their labor, is not it.
It's not it at all.
All right, so that wraps up this episode of the Know Your Rights Camp podcast. Please follow us on social media at Your Rights Camp and subscribe on YouTube at Know Your Rights Camp.